Last 5 seconds. Ready? Start. Sir, this bill has been brought forward for the purpose of improving the position so far as the question of housing in Delhi is concerned. The task has to be approached both in the interest of the landlords and the interest of the tenants, and in particular the interest of the tenants. In this respect, may I very briefly bring under review the position in respect of rent control from 1939 onwards down to the present date. When the war started in 1939, there was naturally an attempt made from numerous quarters, especially of the landlords, to have a short increase in rents in order to prevent any such increase, especially a speculative increase. What the government then did was to have an order on this question known as the Rent Control Order of 1939. It applied to the area of New Delhi, and what it did was to stabilize the rent as it existed during 1939 so that it should not be increased, so that the tenants who were in possession of various houses should not have the inconvenience of paying fantastic rents. That is the reason why the rent as prevailing on 1st January 1939 was stabilized. Then in 1944 an ordinance was passed known as the Delhi Rent Control Ordinance. What it did was it applied the same principle of stabilization plus some increase with a view to meeting the changing situation. In 1944, the whole urban area in the then Delhi province, including naturally New Delhi, came under the orbit of this ordinance. Thereafter, we had an act known as the Delhi and Ajmer Marwar Rent Control Act, which was passed in 1947, and here what was done was to take into account to a certain extent the conditions then obtaining and then to fix a rent on some fair criterion. In the terms of the present bill, you will find that there is a schedule where there have been given three categories of rent. One is known as the original rent, the rent that was fixed as in 1939. Thereafter, some increase had to be effected, and that was done, and that was called as the basic rent. In 1947, when Act was passed for rent control in Delhi and some other areas under the control of the government of India, what was done was 742% was considered as a proper measure of rent so far as the cost and value of the land was concerned. That was how in 1947 a certain criterion was followed, and thereby we had an increase up to 742%, and thereafter that constituted the basic rent. Then we come to the third law on the subject, which was passed in 1952. Therein the rent structure was not substantially changed, but what was done was that whenever there were certain new buildings constructed within a limited period, then in regard to those buildings an exemption was granted from the obligations of the rent control, because the object was that the building construction should be increased, because the population of Delhi has been increasing by leaps and bounds. Therefore what was done was, in respect of the particular period that has been mentioned in this bill, also the rent as fixed between the parties was allowed to continue and to constitute the rent, the standard rent, but only for a period of 7 years. In 1952, as I stated, this particular exemption was granted with a view that after the building had been constructed, the rent should remain as it had been agreed upon between the parties. The object was to induce persons who were in a position to construct buildings to carry on their building activities, because, as I have said, there was a sharp rise in the population of Delhi and there was no consequent rise in the number of houses actually constructed every year. That was the reason why in the act that was passed this particular exemption was granted. Thereafter in 1956, as you are aware, what was done was to grant an interim or temporary protection, especially against eviction. When that act was sponsored before Parliament, it was clearly pointed out by the then Minister for Works, Housing and Supply that that act was passed by way of giving a temporary or interim protection to the tenants against evictions by landlords, so that the government also would have sufficient time to consider the whole position and to see what improvements were necessary for the act. Thus we had the act of 1952, and then we had the interim act of 1956. It has been represented to the government that unless the act is brought into force, persons possessing certain licentiate qualifications and persons who are citizens of India possessing certain foreign medical qualifications which are not recognized under the Indian Medical Council Act 1933 will not be eligible for enrollment on the state medical registers. In the circumstances, government consider that the act should be brought into force without further delay. Already the delay has been too long. Stop.